The wall was too long. That was the problem nobody could solve, and everybody inside the compound understood it the moment they walked the perimeter. The Alamo was not a fortress. It was a mission station built by Franciscan priests to convert and to farm, with a defensive perimeter stretching roughly 440 yards. To hold a line that long, military doctrine of the 1830s called for something close to 1,000 trained soldiers. On the morning of March 6, 1836, the men available to defend it numbered fewer than 250. Do the arithmetic, and the tragedy is already written. Spread 200 defenders across 440 yards of wall, and you place roughly one man every 2 yards. A wall with a gap every 2 yards is not a wall, it is a suggestion. And the commander who understood this best was not inside the Alamo. He was camped to the south, methodical and patient, a Mexican general named Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had spent 13 days studying exactly where that line would break. So how does a defensive position with thick walls, cannon, and some of the most determined fighters of the Texas Revolution fall in roughly 90 minutes? The answer is not courage, and it is not betrayal. The answer is geometry. The walls that were supposed to save the defenders were the very thing that doomed them, and, by the end of this, you will understand precisely why. Here is what I'm going to walk you through. First, the manpower math that made the perimeter indefensible before a single shot of the final assault was fired, and the exact ratio that doctrine demanded versus what the garrison actually had. Second, the specific weak point on the north wall that Santa Anna identified, and why a crack in the masonry decided where hundreds of men would die. Third, the role of the 18 cannon inside the fort, and the cruel reason that more artillery actually made the defense weaker, not stronger. Fourth, the 90-minute timeline of the final assault, told through the geometry of where the walls failed first, second, and last. And fifth, the single tactical decision made weeks earlier that historians still argue sealed the outcome before the siege even began. Stay with me, because that last one reframes the entire battle. I should be clear about how we know what we know. The Alamo left few defending witnesses, since nearly all of its fighting men were killed. So the tactical reconstruction here draws on Mexican army accounts, the surviving reports of officers like José Enrique de la Peña, whose narrative, smuggled out of Mexico and translated only in the 1970s, remains both invaluable and bitterly contested for its authenticity. It draws on the diary of Santa Anna's secretary, Ramón Martínez Caro, on the after-action report of General Vicente Filisola, on the engineering surveys of the mission compound conducted over more than a century of archaeology, and on the work of military historians who have mapped the perimeter against the garrison roles. Where the record is contested, I will say so. The aim is not the myth. The aim is the math of why the walls could not hold. To understand the problem, you have to picture the place as it actually was in early 1836, not as the clean rectangular fort of popular imagination. The Alamo was the former mission San Antonio de Valero, established in 1718, a sprawling complex of a chapel, a long barracks, a low barracks, walled courtyards, and a large open plaza of roughly 3 acres. The walls themselves were impressive in places, adobe and stone, some sections 9 to 12 feet high and between 2.5 and 4 feet thick. Cannonballs would not easily punch through them, and indeed across the 13 days of bombardment, Santa Anna's lighter field pieces, mostly 4-pounders and a pair of howitzers, made little impression on the masonry itself. He never brought up the heavy 12-pounders that could have battered a true breach, because he calculated he would not need them. He was right. But thickness is only one dimension of a wall, and it was never the dimension that mattered here. The dimension that mattered was length, and the relationship between that length and the number of bodies available to stand behind it. A mission was designed to keep out raiders and to enclose livestock. to deter a band of Comanche or Apache horsemen who carried no artillery and had no interest in a prolonged assault on stone. It was never designed to be held against a national army with siege guns, engineers, and thousands of disciplined infantry trained in the European school of the column and the volley. The perimeter that made it a comfortable settlement made it an impossible fortress. There were too many yards of wall and far too few men, and no amount of bravery changes a ratio. Consider what the garrison was working with, and consider what military engineers of the period actually taught about it. The standard rule of thumb in fortification manuals of the era held that a defended rampart required at minimum 1 man per linear yard simply to maintain a continuous firing line, and more like 1.5 to 2 men per yard if you wanted to sustain fire through reloading and absorb casualties. Apply even the most generous version of that rule to 440 yards, and you arrive at the figure I gave you at the start, somewhere near 1,000 men, and that is before you account for reserves, for the sick, for the men who must sleep. Estimates of the actual defenders range from around 182 to perhaps 257, depending on which role you trust and how you count the couriers who slipped out before the end. Take the higher figure, 250. Now place them. The north wall needed men, the south needed men, the chapel, the wooden palisade between the chapel and the low barracks, the cattle pen on the east, the long barracks, the main gate on the south. Every yard of that 440-yard line needed a defender who could see, aim, and reload. There were not enough defenders to do it once, let alone in the shifts that a 13-day siege demands, when men have to sleep, when men fall ill, when men must be pulled off the wall to serve the guns, or carry powder, or shore up the crumbling sections by night. William Barrett Travis, the young commander, only 26 years old, a lawyer by training who had been in Texas barely 3 years, shared authority with the frontiersman Jim Bowie until Bowie collapsed with what was probably typhoid pneumonia and took to a cot from which he never rose. Travis understood the bind exactly. His letters from the siege are not the words of a man who misjudged his odds. He knew the numbers. On February 24th, he wrote his famous appeal to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, pledging to never surrender or retreat, and signing it, victory or death. But read past the defiance, and you find a man counting. He reports the enemy's strength, he reports his own. He sends rider after rider, men like the courier Albert Martin and later James Bonham, who actually rode back into the doomed fort, carrying news that no large relief was coming. Travis could read the same arithmetic that Santa Anna could. Roughly 1 man every 2 yards. A defender who fires his single-shot flintlock then must bite a cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, prime the pan, and bring the weapon back to the shoulder, leaves a 2-yard hole in the line for the 15 to 20 seconds that whole sequence takes. Multiply those holes across the whole perimeter and you do not have a defensive line. You have a screen, and a screen can be torn. The only thing that masks the gaps is volume of fire, and volume of fire is precisely what too few men cannot sustain. Now let us talk about the man on the other side of that wall, because his patience is the part of this story most retellings rush past in their hurry to get to the heroics. Santa Anna, who styled himself the Napoleon of the West and meant it as more than vanity, arrived at San Antonio de Bexar on February 23rd with an advance force that swelled as his columns caught up over the following days to several thousand, perhaps as many as 6,000 counting the full army, though closer to 2,000 effectives were committed to the actual assault. He did not storm the Alamo on day 1. He did not need to. He understood that time was a weapon and that a position too large for its garrison only grows weaker the longer it is besieged, as exhaustion and casualties and dwindling powder thin an already impossible line. So for 13 days he tightened the noose. he raised a blood-red flag from the tower of the San Fernando Church to signal no quarter. He moved his artillery batteries closer night by night, from 400 yards in to less than 200, so that the defenders slept less and worked harder, repairing by darkness what the guns loosened by day. He probed. He sent skirmishers against the outworks. He waited. What was he probing for? The weak point. And this is the heart of the geometry. In any fortification, defenders concentrate their strength where they expect the blow and accept thinness elsewhere. This is not cowardice or carelessness, it is the only rational response to a finite number of men, and every competent commander does it. But with so few men, the Alamo's garrison could not be merely thin in places. They had to be dangerously, fatally bare almost everywhere in order to be adequate anywhere. They had to gamble on where the main assault would come and wait that section, stripping the rest. Santa Anna's job, across those 13 days, was simply to find where they were thinnest and where the wall itself was weakest, and to send his hammer there. A siege, properly understood, is not primarily a contest of force. It is a contest of information. The besieger who learns the defender's weak seam before he commits has already won, because he can mass everything against the one point that cannot hold. He found it on the north wall. The northern section of the perimeter had been a chronic engineering headache from the moment the Texans occupied the place the previous December. The original mission wall there had partially collapsed or been deliberately torn down at some earlier point, and the defenders, led in their fortification work by the engineer Green Jameson, a lawyer turned amateur military engineer who had been doing his best with no formal training and almost no materials, had been propping it up throughout the siege. It was a patched wall, a hasty composite of the surviving stone, reinforced from the inside with a crib of timber and packed earth, an earthwork backing held in place by a wooden framework. This was sound enough as a way to stop a cannonball, which simply buries itself in dirt. But from the outside to an attacking column, it offered something the smooth, high stone sections did not. The exposed timbers and the rough, irregular repaired masonry offered footholds. The very repairs that kept it standing gave climbing men something to grip, something to brace a foot or a hand against as they scaled it under fire. A perfectly smooth 12-foot wall is a serious obstacle to a man on foot with a musket and a bayonet and no ladder. A 9-foot patchwork of stone, log, and packed earth is a staircase. That is the cruel logic of the weak point. Santa Anna did not aim his main assault at the chapel, the strongest and most iconic structure, the one tourists photograph today, with its thick stone and its elevated gun platform built up on a ramp of earth and timber at the rear. He aimed it at the patched, propped, vulnerable north wall, because geometry and engineering told him that is where the line would tear with the fewest of his own men lost. A general's job is not to attack the enemy's strength and prove his valor against it. It is to find the seam and drive through it with everything he has. The north wall was the seam, and Santa Anna had 13 days and a tower full of officers with telescopes to confirm it. Now consider the cannon, because here is where intuition fails most people. The Alamo had an unusually large amount of artillery for a frontier position, somewhere around 18 to 21 guns, a haul the Texans had captured the previous year when they drove General Cos out of San Antonio. Among them was an 18-pounder, a genuinely heavy piece, the largest cannon in Texas at the time, mounted at the southwest corner where it could command the town and the approaches. More cannon should mean a stronger defense. In this case, the opposite was closer to the truth, and the reason is again about bodies and geometry. A cannon does not fire itself. Each gun needs a crew, ideally 6 to 9 trained men, to swab, load, aim, prime, and fire it, and to manhandle it back into position after every recoil. Skilled artillerymen were among the scarcest specialists in the garrison, and a misjudged powder charge or a gun double-loaded in the chaos of an assault is as likely to kill its own crew as the enemy. Every man assigned to work a cannon was a man not standing on the wall with a rifle. If you crewed even a dozen of those guns properly, you would consume the better part of 100 men, nearly half the entire garrison, on the artillery alone. They could not, so the guns were thinly manned, often by improvised crews. Worse, the guns had to be mounted somewhere, and mounting heavy artillery along that sprawling perimeter meant building earthen ramps and platforms, since the mission walls had no proper firing terraces, and it meant dispersing your firepower across the same impossible length you could not man with infantry. The cannon was spread thin for the same reason the men were. And here is the decisive point that most accounts miss. In the dark, in a fast infantry rush at close range, massed cannon firing canister, which turns a cannon into an enormous shotgun spraying musket balls, is far more decisive than the same guns scattered around a 400-yard ring, where most of them point uselessly at empty ground and could only ever bear on one narrow arc. A gun on the south wall cannot fire on a column hitting the north. Its range and its destructive power are irrelevant if it is aimed the wrong way, and 20 guns aimed in 20 directions cannot concentrate their fire the way Santa Anna concentrated his men. So the artillery that looked like strength on an inventory list became another expression of the perimeter's core flaw. Too much to defend, too few to defend it, and every resource, men and guns alike, smeared too thinly across too many yards of wall. The defenders did manage in the opening minutes to bring several guns to bear on the attacking columns with terrible effect, and we will come to that. But the structural reality never changed. Santa Anna, by contrast, could concentrate. He chose his point, and at his chosen point, he could bring overwhelming local superiority. Even though across the whole field, the difference, while already enormous, was not what decided it. What decided it was that at the single square of ground where the battle would actually be won, he could put 5 or 10 men against every one of theirs. Now the assault itself told as geometry. Santa Anna's officers, several of whom argued the assault was unnecessary and that the garrison would be starved out in days without the loss of a single soldier, were overruled. He wanted the storm. In the cold dark before dawn on March 6th, with the temperature near freezing, he organized roughly 1,400 to 1,800 men into 4 attacking columns, commanded by Cos, Colonel Duque, Colonel Romero, and Colonel Morales, aimed at different faces of the compound, with a reserve of his best troops, the grenadiers and the elite zapadores, the engineer sappers, held back under his own hand. This is the key tactical idea, and it is brutally simple. 4 columns hitting 4 points at once means the defenders cannot reinforce. If you have just enough men to thinly cover the whole perimeter and the enemy strikes everywhere simultaneously, no defender can leave his section to help another, because the moment he does, his own stretch of wall is breached behind him. The simultaneous attack froze the garrison in place. Every man had to fight where he stood, and every man could see only his own desperate arc of the fight. There was no maneuver left to them, no concentration, no counterstroke. The geometry had taken those options away before the first man stepped off. The first rush came against the north and the northeast, and the defenders did what determined men do. They had been warned in the last instant by the men on watch, and they ran to their posts. Their initial volleys and the canister fire from their cannon raking down the line of the approaching columns tore into the close-packed Mexican formations and stalled them. The attack faltered. The columns, advancing in dense masses, because that is how the doctrine of the day moved infantry, made perfect targets, and the slaughter in those first minutes was almost entirely one-sided. Men fell in heaps. Some of the Mexican soldiers, raw conscripts among the veterans, fired wildly forward and hit their own comrades in the front ranks in the darkness and confusion. For a few minutes, it even looked as if the line might hold, as the columns bunched and recoiled under fire, as officers were cut down trying to drive their men forward, as Colonel Duque went down wounded and his column lost its momentum. But here the manpower math reasserted itself with terrible force. The defenders could fire a devastating first volley, even a second. What they could not do was sustain it everywhere at once, because reloading left those 15-second gaps, and there were not enough men to fill them, and the guns, once fired, needed long seconds to swab and recharge. The volume of fire that had stopped the columns could not be maintained. The Mexican columns, regrouped and re-aimed by their surviving officers and stiffened by Santa Anna's committed reserve, surged again. And this time they did something their commander had not even ordered, but which the ground itself produced. They converged. Columns that had been aimed at separate points drifted and crowded toward the north wall, drawn by the simple instinct of frightened, driven men to move toward where their fellows were already massing and where the resistance was visibly breaking, and toward where that patched, climbable masonry offered a way up. The four-pronged attack became, in effect, one great wedge against the weakest point. Numbers funneled into the seam. The first men reached the base of the wall, where the defenders on the parapet directly above could no longer depress their guns enough to hit them, a dead angle. And from that sheltered strip beneath the wall, the attackers found their footholds and began to climb. Once the first attackers were over the north wall, the geometry inverted completely. The defenders had been facing outward, each man covering his narrow arc of the perimeter, his back to the open plaza. Now there were enemies inside, behind the line, firing into the backs of men still defending the wall against the front. And a wall is worthless, worse than worthless, once the enemy is on the wrong side of it, because now it traps the defenders as surely as it was meant to protect them. What followed was not really a wall fight anymore. It became a fight for the interior buildings, the long barracks and the chapel, room by room, hand to hand, bayonet and knife and clubbed musket, as the surviving defenders abandoned the now useless walls and fell back into the strongest structures, into rooms they had loopholed and barricaded for exactly this last stand. The plaza, that open 3-acre space the long perimeter had enclosed, became a killing ground, swept by the attackers now pouring through the breach in the north and through the gun positions they had overrun, and the defenders' own captured cannon were turned and fired point-blank against the barricaded doors of the barracks. Travis is reported to have fallen early, near the north wall he had fought so hard to hold, struck in the forehead by a single ball as the breach he most feared finally opened, dying in the first phase of the assault, almost on the spot where his arithmetic had told him the end would come. Bowie, too ill to stand, is said to have died on his cot in a room of the low barracks, a brace of pistols in his hands by some accounts, helpless by others. The defenders in the chapel, among them the men serving the high gun platform at its rear, were among the last, and the 18-pounder at the southwest corner, the heaviest gun in Texas, fell silent, as the men serving it were overrun and the position taken from behind. From the first column stepping off to the last, organized resistance collapsing, the whole thing took roughly 90 minutes. Some accounts make it less, an hour or even 45 minutes of real fighting once the walls were breached. 90 minutes to undo a 13-day siege, because once the seam tore, the perimeter that had always been too long became instantly irrelevant. There was no second line. A position held by too few men has no depth, no reserve to seal a breach, no inner wall to fall back to and hold. The barracks and the chapel were not a second line of defense in any real sense. They were merely the last places to die. When the north wall failed, everything failed, almost at once, the way a chain does not fail gradually, but altogether the instant its weakest link parts. This is the deep lesson that geometry teaches. A defense that is uniformly stretched to its limit has no margin anywhere, and so the failure of any one point is the failure of the whole, with no interval in between. Which brings me to the decision made weeks earlier, the one historians still argue over, and the one that may have sealed the outcome before Santa Anna ever arrived. It is this: should the Alamo have been held at all? Sam Houston, commanding the Texan forces, is widely reported to have wanted San Antonio de Bexar abandoned, its cannon removed or destroyed and dumped in the river, the position given up entirely because he understood, as a man who had served under Andrew Jackson and seen real war, that a small force in an oversized mission could not stop a national army and would only be destroyed in place to no purpose. He is said to have sent Jim Bowie himself in January with discretion to blow up the fortifications and withdraw the artillery. But the order to abandon was never clear or never enforced. The politics of the fractious Texan provisional government cut across the military logic, and the men on the spot, Bowie and Travis and the others, chose to stay, to hold, and to fortify. That choice kept a couple hundred men behind walls that the cold logic of the perimeter said could not be defended, and the 18 guns they could not bear to abandon became precisely the dead weight that helped pin them in place. Since you cannot make a fast retreat while dragging 20 cannon, you have no horses to pull. You can read that two ways, and serious historians do, and I will not pretend the question is settled. One reading is that holding the Alamo was a tactical error in the purest sense, that those men were committed to an indefensible geometry against the explicit better judgment of their own commanding general, and lost for it. That their deaths were a waste born of confusion, pride, and a divided command. The other reading is that the 13 days they bought were decisive, that they delayed Santa Anna's advance into the Texan interior, that they bled and exhausted his army, and above all, that the manner of their deaths, the no-quarter slaughter of the entire garrison, produced a rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," that gave Houston the time to gather and drill his army, and gave his men the fury they needed 6 weeks later at San Jacinto on April 21st, where Houston's force fell on Santa Anna's during the afternoon siesta and destroyed it in 18 minutes, capturing Santa Anna himself the next day and forcing the treaty that effectively secured Texan independence. By that, reading the Alamo's defenders lost the position but bent the entire war toward victory. I will not flatten that debate for you, because the evidence genuinely runs both ways, and reasonable people weigh the 13 days and the rallying cry differently. I will only point out that both readings begin from the same fact, the fact this whole story has been about. The walls could not be held. Everyone who looked at the math, Houston, Travis, Santa Anna, knew it. The only real question then and now was what to do with a position you cannot defend, and whether dying in it slowly can be worth more than abandoning it cleanly. So when people say the Alamo fell to Santa Anna's overwhelming numbers, they are right, but they are describing the symptom, not the cause. Overwhelming numbers only overwhelm because there is too much line for too few defenders to hold. The cause was a defensive perimeter built for priests and cattle, not for war. 440 yards of wall and fewer than 250 men to stand behind it. Roughly one defender every 2 yards, against a doctrine that demanded one every yard or better. Artillery spread as thin as the infantry, 20 guns pointing in 20 directions when concentration was everything. A patched north wall offering footholds to the very men who would tear the seam. And an enemy patient enough to spend 13 days finding exactly where the geometry would break, disciplined enough to strike 4 points at once so the defenders could not shift, and willing to spend hundreds of his own soldiers' lives to do it. The thick walls everyone remembers, the 9 and 12 feet of stone, were never the strength of the Alamo. Their length was its fatal weakness, and thickness could not redeem length. The defenders did not lose for want of courage. By every account, they fought with as much of it as men have ever shown. They lost because no amount of courage can man a line that is twice too long, and because the same walls meant to shelter them became, the moment the seam tore, the trap that held them in place to die. If you want more battles broken down by the math and geometry that actually decided them, rather than the myths we inherit, subscribe and hit the like button so the next one finds you.